The world remembers the Titanic, but it has forgotten New York's other maritime disaster, a tragedy that killed over 1,000 people. The victims weren't the wealthy. They were mothers and children on a church picnic. This was no accident. It was a betrayal. A story of corporate greed that turned life-saving equipment into instruments of death. How was this covered up, and why was it erased from history?
Before the tragedy, there was a world, a city within a city. In 1904, Manhattan's Lower East Side was not just a neighborhood. It was Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. Outside of Berlin and Vienna, it was the largest German-speaking community on Earth. This was a vibrant 400-block world transplanted from the old country to the new. Life was lived in German. Avenue B was the German Broadway, its sidewalks lined with markets and shops. The community had its own German-language schools, theaters, beer gardens, and social clubs called Vereine. There were Turnvereins for gymnastics, grand social halls for weddings, and legendary restaurants like Lukau's. And at the spiritual and social heart of it all, at 323 East 6th Street, stood the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church. For 17 consecutive years, the church's annual summer outing was the highlight of the social calendar. A cherished tradition celebrating the end of the Sunday school year, it was a precious escape from the sweltering, crowded city for a day of games and leisure. In 1904, for a charter fee of just $350, they secured the grandest excursion steamer on the East River, a majestic triple-decked vessel named the P.S. General Slocum. Built in 1891, the P.S. General Slocum was an impressive sight. A majestic 250-foot triple-decker side-wheel steamer, she was constructed from white oak and yellow pine, painted a brilliant white, and licensed to carry 2,500 passengers. To the public, she was the pride of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company's fleet, a symbol of modern leisure. But beneath the fresh paint, the Slocum had a dark reputation. The press had nicknamed her an unlucky craft. Her history was a litany of negligence. Just 4 months after her launch, she ran aground. In 1894 alone, she hit a sandbar, collided with a tugboat, and ran aground again during a storm. The following years brought more collisions, another grounding that left 400 passengers stranded overnight, and even an on-board riot that the crew struggled to contain. This was not bad luck. It was a clear pattern of systemic neglect. The 13-year-old wooden vessel was a disaster waiting to happen. Yet just 5 weeks before her final voyage, on May 5, 1904, the General Slocum was certified as safe and in fine working order by federal inspectors from the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service. That certification was a lie, and it would prove to be a death sentence.
The morning of June 15, 1904, dawned bright and beautiful. At the East 3rd Street Pier, the mood was a celebration. A German brass band played lively tunes as the congregation of St. Mark's boarded, dressed in their Sunday best. Nearly 1,400 passengers filled the 3 decks, the vast majority women and children, as most of the men were at work on a Wednesday. As the final passengers came aboard, a strange and chilling event occurred. 2 families who had already boarded suddenly rushed to disembark. They told others they had a premonition of disaster the night before and could not bring themselves to stay. Their warnings were dismissed amid the excitement. In the pilot house stood 68-year-old Captain William Van Schaik, a veteran mariner who until that day held an award for his excellent safety record. At approximately 9:40 a.m., the General Slocum cast off its lines and steamed into the East River, its flags flying in the breeze. Onlookers on the shore waved as the happy throng headed north towards the treacherous, turbulent currents of Hell Gate. For the 1,021 passengers who would never return, it was the beginning of the end.
Less than 30 minutes into the voyage, as the Slocum approached Hell Gate, the first sign of trouble appeared. Unseen by most passengers, a wisp of smoke began to curl from a forward storeroom on the lower deck. A 12-year-old boy named Frank Brodsky was one of the first to see it and knew something was terribly wrong. Frank raced to the pilot house to warn the captain. He was gruffly dismissed. According to reports, Captain Van Schaik told the boy to shut up and mind your own business, believing it was a childish prank. Around the same time, a deckhand discovered the source: a fire in the lamp room, a storage space dangerously filled with packing hay, oily rags, paint, and kerosene. In a moment of panic, he made a fatal error. He tried to smother the fire, then ran for help, leaving the cabin door open wide and giving the flames unlimited oxygen. The fire, fed by the open door and flammable materials, exploded. It was a full 10 minutes after the first wisp of smoke was seen that Captain Van Schaik was finally notified that his ship was burning. 10 minutes! An eternity on a wooden ship packed with families. The captain now faced a choice that would seal the fate of every soul on board.
With his ship rapidly turning into an inferno, Captain Van Schaik had multiple options to immediately beach the vessel. The shores of Manhattan's Upper East Side were nearby, as were docks in the Bronx and Queens. On the Astoria shoreline, the captain of a dredge boat saw the smoke and frantically blew his whistle, wondering why the Slocum didn't stop. But Van Schaik made a different choice. He would later testify that he feared spreading the fire to the lumber yards and gas tanks that lined the shore. This prioritization of property over human life was a catastrophic misjudgment. Instead of turning towards the nearest land, he ordered the ship full speed ahead, gambling that he could race the fire to North Brother Island over a mile away. It was the deadliest miscalculation imaginable. The headwind created by the vessel's increased speed acted like a giant bellows, fanning the flames and driving them with terrifying speed back across the 3 wooden decks. The fire became a blowtorch aimed directly at the panicked crowds of women and children huddled at the stern. The one place that should have been a refuge was now directly in the inferno's path.
As the fire roared toward them, the passengers' last hope was the ship's safety equipment. But what they found was not a chance for survival, but a series of horrifying deceptions. The ship hadn't had a fire drill all year, and the untrained crew, many of whom were hired just for the day, quickly abandoned any attempt to fight the blaze. The passengers were on their own, surrounded by a conspiracy of neglect. When the crew finally unrolled the fire hoses, the cheap 13-year-old linen, rotten from years of exposure, burst under the pressure. People surged towards the 6 lifeboats only to find they wouldn't budge. They had been wired to the ship and effectively glued in place by years of thick paint. Their last resort was the life preservers, but when desperate parents grabbed them, the canvas covers, decayed and brittle, exploded into dust, revealing that the cork filling had rotted into a useless, heavy powder. The rot, however, was only part of the lie. The most sinister secret was discovered only after the disaster, during the official investigation. To save money, the manufacturer had committed a fraud so vile it defied belief.
It was an act of pure evil that would turn a device meant for salvation into an instrument of death.
Federal regulations at the time were dangerously flawed. They did not mandate buoyancy tests for life preservers. Instead, they simply required that each device contain 6 pounds of good cork. The weight was the only thing inspectors checked. To meet this weight requirement while using cheap, lightweight granulated cork dust, the manufacturer, the Non-Parel Cork Works of Camden, New Jersey, committed a monstrous fraud. They secretly inserted heavy iron bars into the center of the cork blocks to bring them up to the legal weight. The devices meant to save lives were deliberately weighted to pull people under the water. When President Theodore Roosevelt learned of the fraud, he declared the offense was of so heinous a character that it is difficult to comment upon it with proper self-restraint. For the mothers and children on the Slocum, this corporate lie would now become their horrific reality.
In the chaos, panicked mothers, believing they were saving their children, strapped on the heavy, defective life preservers and tossed them overboard. One survivor, Catherine Casbaum, later gave a chilling account of the horror that followed. She jumped into the water and saw women and children all around her. They all seemed to be drowning, she recalled. The heavy, waterlogged wool clothing of the era pulled people down. Few knew how to swim. Those who jumped near the sides of the boat were crushed and mutilated by the ship's enormous, still-churning paddle wheels. Survivor John Tishner, just 13 years old, saw women with their hair and dresses on fire jumping into the water. He watched mothers throw their babies overboard and then leap in after them, only for both to disappear beneath the waves. As the inferno consumed the ship, the wooden stanchions supporting the decks gave way. With a deafening roar, the upper decks collapsed, plunging hundreds of people into the fiery pit below. As the burning wreck finally crashed onto the rocks of North Brother Island, the choice was no longer between fire and water. For most, it was a choice between 2 different kinds of death. But on the shore, an unexpected group of heroes was already running to help.
North Brother Island was no welcoming sanctuary. In 1904, it was a place of forced isolation, home to Riverside Hospital, a quarantine facility for the city's most feared contagious diseases: smallpox, scarlet fever, typhoid, and tuberculosis. The patients were locked in their wards, forbidding from contact with the outside world. From their windows, the hospital staff and patients watched the floating inferno approach. The health commissioner reported that patients went wild at things they saw from their windows and went screaming and beating at the doors. But as soon as the ship hit the rocks, the staff rushed to the shore. Nurses in their white uniforms waded into the water up to their necks, forming human chains to pass survivors to safety. One hospital employee, Pauline Puitz, swam out repeatedly to pull victims ashore. The most celebrated hero was Mary McCann, a teenage Irish immigrant and a patient herself, recovering from measles. She swam into the chaos time and time again, reportedly saving as many as 20 children. These were not trained rescuers. They were nurses, doctors, and the sick, risking their own lives to pull strangers from a floating hell. But they weren't the only unlikely saviors that day. Another group was watching from a nearby island, a place even more isolated than the quarantine hospital.
Just across the water from the disaster lay another island of isolation, Rikers Island, then home to the city's workhouse and prison. On that morning, A physician, Dr. Nathan Broder, was on duty supervising a group of inmates working outdoors. When the prisoners saw the burning Slocum heading for North Brother Island, two of them, John Murther and Dan Casey, approached the doctor. According to a New York Times report, they literally compelled Dr. Broder to take them in a small rowboat over to the scene of the disaster. The doctor was initially reluctant, fearing the inmates might try to escape, but their insistence was undeniable. The three men, the doctor and the two convicts, rode into the chaos of smoke and screaming. They worked as a team, pulling both the living and the dead from the water, making trip after trip to North Brother Island to hand over their cargo until all three were too exhausted to continue. Their story, like the disaster itself, would be largely forgotten, but in the days that followed, forgetting was impossible.
The fire was out, but for the families of Kleindeutschland, the horror was just beginning. The recovery effort was a grim and heartbreaking task. For days, the tides of the East River delivered the dead to the city's shores. To dislodge bodies trapped in the river mud, a cannon was brought to the scene and fired over the water. The city's morgues were quickly overwhelmed. A temporary morgue was set up on the 26th Street Pier, where bodies were laid out in rows for identification. The streets of Little Germany were clogged with funeral carriages. Doors were draped in crepe ribbons, black for an adult, white for a child. The story of Eugene Ansel, a delicatessen owner, was tragically common. He spent days searching, only to finally identify his wife Louise by the initials engraved on her wedding ring. He lost her and both of his sons. The disaster hadn't just taken lives, it had erased entire families. The Liebenau family was all but wiped out. The only survivor was 6-month-old Adela, who was pulled from the water. The community was shattered, and now the survivors and the city demanded answers.
Shift from grief to a righteous, analytical anger. Quicken the pace. Public outrage was immediate and intense. A furious President Theodore Roosevelt, a New Yorker himself, appointed a federal commission to conduct a thorough investigation. The newspapers were filled with survivor testimonies detailing the rotten equipment, the incompetent crew, and the captain's fatal decision. The city wanted someone to blame. The investigation quickly uncovered a vast conspiracy of negligence and corruption. A federal grand jury handed down indictments against Captain Van Schaik, the managing directors of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, the two federal steamboat inspectors who had certified the ship, and even the managers of the non-paralleled cork works for the iron bars in the life preservers. Evidence emerged that the steamboat company had falsified repair records, scratching out the names of other ships on receipts and writing in the Slocums to deceive inspectors. The evidence was overwhelming. It pointed to a clear web of corporate greed, regulatory failure, and criminal fraud that led directly to the deaths of over 1,000 people. It seemed certain that for once justice would be served. But in the New York of the Gilded Age, justice was a commodity few could afford.
When the trials began, the city watched, expecting accountability, but one by one, those most responsible for the disaster walked free. The managers of the Life Preserver Company were indicted, but never convicted. The two steamboat inspectors who signed off on the faulty equipment were acquitted. The greatest shock came when the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company and its executives were found not guilty, escaping with only a small fine despite the evidence of falsified records. In the end, only one man was convicted for the deaths of 1,021 people, the 70-year-old captain, William Van Schaik.
The judge, in sentencing him, declared, "You are no ordinary criminal. I must make an example of you," and gave him the maximum penalty, 10 years of hard labor at the infamous Sing Sing prison. The final injustice was yet to come. After a relentless campaign by his wife, Captain Van Schaik was pardoned by President William Howard Taft on Christmas Day, 1911, having served less than 4 years. In the end, for the 1,021 lives lost, not a single person would serve a full sentence. For the shattered community of Little Germany, it was the final, devastating blow.
The Slocum disaster did more than kill people. It killed a neighborhood. Traumatized by the immense loss and disgusted by the lack of justice, the remaining residents of Klein-Deutschland began to flee the neighborhood, which was now filled with ghosts. Husbands who had lost their entire families committed suicide. Others moved uptown to Yorkville or returned to Germany. Within a few years, the vibrant community that had defined the Lower East Side for generations was gone forever. This raises the central question: why is this disaster, which claimed 1,021 lives in the heart of New York, so forgotten, while the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, with 146 deaths, and the Titanic, with 1,500 deaths far out in the Atlantic, are household names? The victims of the Slocum were working-class German immigrants. Their story was not one of wealth and glamour. Rising anti-German sentiment in the years before World War I further erased sympathy for their tragedy. The last survivor, Adela Weatherspoon, who was just 6 months old on the day of the fire, offered the most poignant explanation late in her life. "The Titanic had a great many famous people on it," she said. "This was just a family picnic." But the tragedy was not entirely in vain. The sheer horror of the General Slocum forced a reckoning. The public outcry led to a complete overhaul of the corrupt steamboat inspection service and the passage of sweeping new federal maritime safety regulations. These laws mandated fireproof metal bulkheads, strict standards for life preservers, accessible lifeboats, and regular, mandatory fire drills for all passenger vessels. The legacy of the General Slocum is written in the safety regulations that protect travelers to this day. A legacy written in blood. From a tragedy New York chose to forget.